Our next topic is on intermolecular forces. I'm going to cover this in two videos just because I was afraid it was going to be kind of long. So don't just watch part one, be sure you watch part two as well. So intermolecular forces are closely related with phases of matter. And so let's review the three common phases of matter. We have solids, right? These have rigid shape and fixed volume. And the atoms are relatively close together, and they're relatively ordered. And the arrangement of the atoms or molecules that make up the solid are themselves rigid. The atoms and molecules are vibrating a little bit, but they're not really allowed to move around. Liquids have no fixed shape, but they do still have a fixed volume. And so the atoms or molecules are still very close together. They're still very much interacting with one another. And generally, they're just a little bit further apart than they are in the solid. When we go to a gas, they have no fixed shape or volume. And so they'll expand to fill their entire container. And compared to solids and liquids, the atoms or molecules that make up the gas are very far apart. Now, we can convert between solids and liquids largely by changing the temperature. If we heat up a solid, we can convert it to a liquid. If we cool down a liquid, we can convert it to a solid. If you notice, when we talk about converting between a liquid and a gas, this figure also mentions the pressure. And so extreme pressure changes can have an impact on the solid-liquid transition. It very often does not. But pressure can have a huge impact on the liquid and gas transition because the gas molecules are so far apart compared to what they are in a liquid. And so we can convert a liquid into a gas by heating it or by reducing the pressure. And then the opposite is true. We can cool a gas or increase the pressure to convert it into a liquid. And this slide, you don't have to worry about these numbers, but I just like these figures in particular on the right, where you can see solids, sort of fixed in position, very regular, ordered shapes. When we go to a liquid, the distances between the molecules don't change much, but now they're able to move around, and they are no longer sort of held rigidly in place. And then when we go to a gas, now the molecules have no interactions with each other, whereas there are lots of interactions in the liquid and the solid, and the molecules are very, very far apart. I think it is also interesting to point out that water is a little bit unusual compared to most other compounds. For water, the liquid is actually more dense than the solid, and that's fairly unusual, but this is why your ice cubes float. This is why icebergs float. For most other substances, the distance between the molecules decreases when we go to the solid, and so solids tend to have a higher density than the liquid, and so the solid would not float. So water is somewhat unusual with that respect, and this has to do with hydrogen bonding that we'll talk about later on in the video. All right, so what are intermolecular forces, and how do they compare to the chemical bonds that we've been talking about already? So, in general, bonding forces, or chemical bonds, are much stronger than intermolecular forces. And these are what hold compounds together, right? So, what makes water water is the fact that we have covalent bonds connecting and holding the hydrogen atoms to that oxygen atom. Intermolecular forces, on the other hand, are forces that exist between separate molecules, right? So the chemical bonds in water are intramolecular, or bonding forces. If I was to bring another water molecule up to that first water molecule, now this interaction between one water molecule and another water molecule, that's what we refer to as intermolecular forces. Intermolecular forces are generally weaker, and generally much weaker than the strength of chemical bonds. They're also somewhat less directional, right? So the chemical bonds in water hold water into this rigid shape. when we have these intermolecular forces, when we say they're less directional, the exact orientation between the two water molecules so that they interact is somewhat less important. It still kind of matters, and depending on the type of the intermolecular force, it matters more or less, but it's much less important than the directional forces in chemical bonds. The intermolecular forces also are longer range than covalent bonds. And so what holds the molecules together in solids and liquids are the intermolecular forces. Without intermolecular forces, nothing would stick together, and just all substances would be gases. Just a note on terminology, right? Intermolecular forces between two different molecules, right? Like interstate highways, like Interstate 75, that connects Georgia to Tennessee, and I think it goes down into Florida, right? Connecting different states. Whereas intrastate highways, those are highways only within a given state. And so sometimes we call covalent bonds intramolecular forces as opposed to intermolecular forces. And then ionic bonds, because we don't actually have molecules, we can kind of consider them to both be, certainly they are bonding forces, they are chemical bonds, but they also act as intermolecular forces in terms of ionic compounds. All right, so there are a number of different types of intermolecular forces that we need to be familiar with. And I always talk about dipole-dipole interactions, which is a type of intermolecular force first, because I think it's the most straightforward to understand. So dipole-dipole interactions occur when both molecules that are interacting are polar, or they have a dipole moment, right? They have a negative end and a positive end. And so acetone is one such molecule. This is the space-filling model of acetone. We've got our 3 carbons, CH3, CH3, and we've got a C double bond O here. But because of the sort of bent shape and the fact that we have an oxygen on one end and carbons and hydrogens on the other, acetone is polar. So the oxygen end is partially negative, the carbon and hydrogen end is partially positive. And so when you bring two acetone molecules together, the interaction of the positive end on one molecule with the negative end on the other is our dipole-dipole interaction. So one important thing to remember, and I may repeat myself on this because it's so important, whenever we're thinking about intermolecular forces, we always have to be envisioning two molecules interacting. It could be two of the same molecule, but we have to have two molecules interacting in order to have an intermolecular force. Okay, so hydrogen bonding is a second type of intermolecular force. And basically, they're a special type of dipole-dipole interaction. Basically, they're like a dipole-dipole interaction, but they're so much stronger than a regular dipole-dipole interaction that we've given them their whole own category. And so, two conditions must be met in order to have hydrogen bonding. So, the molecules have to be polar, both of them. And one of them has to have a covalent bond between a hydrogen and an oxygen, nitrogen, or a fluorine. The second molecule also has to be polar. It doesn't have to have a hydrogen directly connected to an oxygen, nitrogen, or fluorine, but it does have to contain an oxygen, a nitrogen, or a fluorine. And so water is an example of a compound that hydrogen bonds with itself. So we have a polar molecule, we have a hydrogen covalently bonded to an oxygen in one water, obviously, and then we have another water molecule is polar and has an oxygen. And so we could upgrade this dipole-dipole interaction into a hydrogen bond. Now, it may seem like, well, why do we have two different categories? Right now, we're primarily talking about pure substances, but when we talk about mixtures, as long as one of the molecules meets this criteria, the second criteria is a little bit less stringent. So we can get hydrogen bonding between more compounds than we might expect if they all had to meet this one red criteria. To illustrate sort of why we put hydrogen bonding in its own category, based on our criteria, if I have a sample of water or hydrogen fluoride or ammonia, they can all undergo hydrogen bonding. They're all polar. They all have a hydrogen directly connected to a nitrogen, an oxygen, or a fluorine. These other compounds are not able to hydrogen bond, right? No nitrogens, oxygens, or fluorines. And so like this red curve, what this represents is the hydrides of the elements in oxygen's row. So tellurium, selenium, sulfur, and oxygen are all in the same column. And you can see as we go from H2 with tellurium, H2 with selenium, H2 with sulfur, as the atom that's not hydrogen gets smaller, as we go up the periodic table, the boiling point of those compounds decreases. But then when we get to water, there's this huge change, right? And the same thing happens in nitrogen's row and in fluorine's row. And so clearly something very different is going on with the hydrogen bonding that these molecules can undergo, as opposed to just the dipole-dipole interaction that H2S and HCl and pH3 will undergo. And so this is why we classify hydrogen bonding as its own category, because it does give significantly different properties to compounds that just have dipole-dipole interactions. All right, so the last example on part 1 of the IMF videos is to illustrate the dipole-dipole interaction that exists between two molecules of dimethyl ether. And so here's the formula of dimethyl ether here, and I've kind of tried to write the formula to give us an idea of what the structure looks like. Basically, dimethyl ether looks like water, but rather than having hydrogens, we have these two CH3s. And I've drawn H3C here because the oxygen is connected to the carbon, not the hydrogen. So I've drawn it to correctly show what the oxygen is connected to. And, you know, we have the, go ahead and draw the two lone pairs on oxygen. It looks just like water, except big old CH3s instead of hydrogens. But it's going to be polar just like water. The CH3 end is going to be partially positive. The oxygen end is going to be partially negative. And so when we bring in another dimethyl ether, I'll draw this one in red. No, that is not what I intended to do. Try that again. Right, it's the partial negative end of the black dimethyl ether interacting with the partial positive end of the red dimethyl ether, and this is our dipole-dipole interaction. And so if we were to ask, can dimethyl ether, two molecules of dimethyl ether, hydrogen bond with one another? And the answer is no. Right? Both molecules meet the second criteria. They're polar and they have an oxygen. But the first criteria for hydrogen bonding is that we have to have a hydrogen directly covalently bonded to an oxygen, a nitrogen, or a fluorine. And in this case, all the hydrogens are directly connected to carbons, not the oxygen. So dimethyl ether has dipole-dipole interactions, but they can't hydrogen bond. Now, this gets back to our mixture. So we're kind of jumping ahead to the next chapter a little bit, but I think it's useful to talk about it now. Can a molecule of dimethyl ether hydrogen bond to a molecule of water? So if I draw another dimethyl ether here, now is to bring a water into the picture. Right, this interaction, water meets the first criteria. I have a polar molecule and I have a hydrogen directly covalently bonded to an oxygen. The criteria for the second molecule is less stringent. To be hydrogen bonding, water met the first criteria. For the second criteria, I just need a polar molecule that contains nitrogen, oxygen, or fluorine. And dimethyl ether meets that second criteria. So two dimethyl ethers can't hydrogen bond with each other, But if I add dimethyl ether to water, I will get hydrogen bonding between the water and the dimethyl ether molecules. All right, so we've talked about dipole-dipole interactions and hydrogen bonding. In the next video, we'll talk about some additional types of intermolecular forces and talk about how the strengths of all these relate to one another.